This is Minds Blown.
For this Memorial Day, Honda's celebrating the way Americans celebrate best, with pyrotechnics. We're talking the big stuff. Because when you can get a Honda for an incredible holiday deal, we think it's worthy of its own monument. Meet Mount Savemore.
Get into KBB.com's best value brand at the Honda Memorial Day sales event.
Hello and welcome back to Minds Blown. We're your hosts, Olamide Samuel and
Vincent Ntandi.
And on this podcast, we explore stories that challenge perceptions and shed light on the complexities of our world. And today, as Memorial Day approaches, we are delving into the intricate relationship between memorials, war culture, and public history. We're going to hand over to Vincent to start us off with this exploration of the history of Memorial Day.
Thanks. Before I do that, you sound a little bit under the weather. So last time we were recording, you were just getting back from a trip to Africa. So it looks like you may have gotten a little ill from there. You look like audience can't see you, but you won a couple of rounds with Muhammad Ali here. So how are you feeling?
I felt like Mike Tyson and Muhammad Ali threw a jab and a right hook right in my face.
Well, I'm sure our listeners are happy that you're prevailing and you're sticking it out. So it's good to see you again, my friend, and hope you feel better soon. And yes, we're going to look at Memorial Day and public history and monuments. But as we usually do, let's start off with a story of Cold War history that is usually not talked about or forgotten. We're going to start in 1959, which was right when the Cuban Revolution happened.
The road to Havana paved with glory for rebel chieftain Fidel Castro, 32-year-old man of the hour in Cuba. His army of irregulars have taken over an island of 6.5 million. And now, News of the Day brings to your screen the voice of Senor Castro, non-practicing lawyer, revolutionist by profession, who has often said, "I am fighting for a democratic Cuba and an end to dictatorship." And soon, with diplomatic recognition received from the U.S. and other countries, Cuba can begin the big task of returning to normal.
And right after the revolution happened and Castro took power, Che Guevara and about 5 other goodwill ambassadors, if you will, went on a tour of over 10 countries. This included the United Arab Republic at the time, India, Japan, Indonesia, and Yugoslavia. And what they were trying to do was promote goodwill, but also they were hoping to get some deals to boost exports of their sugar, Cuban sugar, which was their main export and source of income. And this was planned to, especially in Japan, and they were hoping that any of the agreements they got with Japan and these countries would help purchase more equipment for agriculture, fishing boats, and things of that nature. So the group arrives in Japan on July 15th. And after meeting with some government officials, they start to head west. And after touring some automobile and aircraft factories, Che Guevara made it clear that he wanted to visit Hiroshima. And this was not part of the itinerary. In fact, the government really didn't want them to go and, make a fuss over this at all. And he was told, though, that on July 24th, that there was a flight from Osaka to Hiroshima and it would take less than an hour. And he said he really wanted to go to lay flowers at the Peace Park and at the memorial, even if it meant canceling everything else on his agenda. And so they agreed to it, and they were really scrambling as far as trying to organize this whole thing. And so he goes there and he travels through the night to Hiroshima. And in the wee hours of the morning when nobody's really around, he goes to visit the Peace Park in Hiroshima. And when he goes there, he makes it clear that part of this is to look at what U.S. imperialism has done to this country and can do to other countries. And at the time, he was 31 years old. And after he lays the flowers down at the Peace Park, he stood silent and he stood erect, and he was gazing so intently. There's photographs of him and how deep of thought he was in at this moment. And then he turned to the guide, the Japanese guide that he was with. And in English, he said to him, quote, "America did a terrible thing. Aren't you Japanese angry about the atrocity that was perpetrated upon you?" And the guide was really stunned and taken aback that he said this, and that the intensity, he said, of Che being silent until then. And then they went to the atomic bomb survivors hospital, and he saw the human shadow on the steps of one of the banks there that's famous in Hiroshima. And when he returned to Cuba, his son, who's now 55, 56 years old, recently said that he never failed to mention Hiroshima whenever he spoke about Japan. In fact, his son recently was in Hiroshima and is part of a project on his father's legacy. There was a photo exhibit in Tokyo about this, and his son made clear just how much this issue of nuclear disarmament meant to his father. So, another piece of history in the Cold War with nuclear weapons that rarely anybody talks about and so many people don't even know happened.
It's a really interesting story, almost sort of an origin story, if you will, of the practice and culture of world leaders going to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park.
Taking you live now to Hiroshima in Japan. World leaders are visiting the Peace Memorial Park. This is after arriving for the G7 Leaders Summit. They're laying wreaths, of course. This is to mark the occasion, keep that shot up there, of the bombing of Hiroshima back in World War II, August 6, 1945.
I mean, last year we saw the G7 leaders actually make a trip to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. And that even caused some controversy because one of these leaders, Joe Biden, the President of the United States, visited the Peace Memorial Park. And of course, for those that know how the US's nuclear arsenal works, the president exercises, significant control over the nuclear arsenals. And part of that control is to carry around something called the nuclear football. And the nuclear football is essentially the launch codes, the button that one has to press to launch a nuclear strike.
Just a few feet from the president, no matter where the commander-in-chief happens to be, a military aide carries a briefcase. It's nicknamed the football, and the power this satchel can unleash is legendary.
Immense, unprecedented power. The United States currently, right now, deploys approximately 900 nuclear warheads that are on the order of 10 to 20 times more powerful than the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
5 military aides, one from each branch of the armed forces, work in a rotation carrying the football.
The result of a decision the president would make is so grotesquely horrible, It would change the face of the earth, it would change humanity, it would change mankind. And I guess when you're on duty, you try not to think about the import of that, but you're fully prepared to do so if you have to.
And the controversy of Joe Biden visiting the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park is that the nuclear football had to be with him and was with him. And so there was this deep and significant irony of the fact that leaders around the world, many of whom controlled the nuclear arsenals and one of whom actually had the trigger for a nuclear arsenal, were purporting to pay respects to the victims of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. While you were telling that story, there was something that struck my mind, and I want you to expand on this a bit further. You mentioned very briefly something about human shadows. What are these human shadows?
The heat rays were so devastating that there's shadows of human beings that vaporized, and the shadow of that person is it's a permanent fixture on concrete, on buildings. And some of those you can actually still see in the city, in certain places if you know where they are, but there's also pieces of these buildings that have been taken into the museums as well. That type of devastation was with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We know that the bombs that we have now are so much more powerful than what we had in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If you've been to Hiroshima, that peace park, I don't know how you go to some place like that and not be affected. I've gone for years, and there's never a time where I've been there, no matter how many times I've gone, where it just runs over me like a freight train. And it's part of a big reason why I got into this is from the first trip I went. And so it really made me, when I looked, I remember being a student and looking at the museums there and the parks and thinking about how we in the United States or other parts of the world, how we view peace, how we view war. What we're going to be talking about today is really important because we give meaning to how we represent something. How a memorial or a museum is structured, the words that we use, whether it's in a podcast, whether it's in singing, whether it's in writing, the images we produce, the emotions we associate with this. So the way that we classify and conceptualize the values we ascribe to it, the representation works as much through what is included in an exhibit as much as what's not included. And so I think that's important when we look at how we view war and peace and these kind of things. And so I think it's important to look at this stuff. Memorial Day in the United States, it's observed the last Monday of May. It's supposed to honor the men and women who died while serving in the U.S. military, and it was originally known as Decoration Day. It originated in the years following the Civil War and became an official federal holiday in 1971. Many Americans observe Memorial Day by visiting cemeteries or memorials, holding family gatherings. It kind of marks the beginning of the summer. There's usually some sort of big thing, maybe at the Capitol, and it's a very nationalistic, it's a very patriotic kind of thing. But again, what are we celebrating? And the idea that if we are critical in any way of the military, the decision to drop the bomb, it's somehow looked at as then we are insulting, we are desecrating the troops and what they've, those that sacrificed. And I don't think it needs to be one or the other. And I remember going to school, graduate school, and there were a lot of folks that went in that direction of public history. And whether you're working in national parks or whether you're working in a museum, you're curating, these are working in archives. These are important jobs. And I think there's a real place for public history in all of our lives because, we don't realize we can say, oh, I don't pay attention to that commercial. I don't pay attention to that exhibit, but we do. It gets in us. And so I really give credit to those folks that went on that track of public history.
And like you mentioned, there's a curation function that these public historians have. And you also raised the question of what are we actually celebrating? And I think it's important to have the freedom to be objective, possibly critical about the remembrance of acts of conflict and how we remember them and the completeness of that remembrance, I think, is important. For example, you mentioned the US's culture of Memorial Day or Remembrance Day and how there's visits to memorials, there's barbecues, parades, there's gatherings, and it's pretty much a public holiday. But how much of this ceremony actually reflects on what we're remembering, actually reflects on the various wars, the causes of the wars, and the victims of these wars, whether they be American lives or the other lives? How deep is this reflection?
This Memorial Day, find a Budman inside packages of Budweiser, Bud Light, and Bud Dry Draft. Budman! Getting warmer. You could win a volleyball. You could win one of thousands of prizes. How about a Sea Ray sport boat? How about a small Caribbean island? Hey, that's not one of the prizes. He's lying. He's lying. Budman. See you guys. Nothing beats a Bud. Man.
Yeah, and it's also, when you start to think about this, it kind of all ties into previous podcasts we've done, right? So it ties into, we've talked about sports in the inaugural episode of the flyovers and the giant flags and all that's going to happen. It's baseball season, Americana, it's all that kind of stuff, and it's tied in together. And you see it again in entertainment. Like, again, we talked about that with the Oscars. There's a lot of times when people will say, well, I don't really know what's going on over there, or because I don't either want to pay attention, I just want to divorce myself from all of it. But also the idea that it doesn't affect me, right? People often said with why weren't people in the streets as much for, say, Afghanistan or the war in Iraq, which there were millions, but compared to Vietnam. But part of that was because, one, there was no draft, and that makes things different, right? So there was a stake in this in a way where you saw people go, well, my kid's not in Afghanistan. It's a million miles away. I don't understand it. It's always going to be a mess. And so therefore I'm not really into it. But war affects us no matter where it is.
Yeah.
Because if you think about your 401k plan, who's invested, what companies are investing in, say, right now with Israel and Palestine, or you think about what's reported on the news, or what shows are being produced as a result of war going on in the world, movies that are being produced. The conversations you have with family members can go a bad way or unite based on what's happening with war in the world. Your own mental health and how much you're scrolling and seeing it. I mean, we see that all the time right now, right? I mean, how much can I take? The first 2 hours this morning, I'm doing nothing but reading about Gaza, and you're just, how do you rebound from that and say, okay, now I got to carry on with the rest of my day? So the idea that war doesn't affect every person really in the world, because it's the economy, it's what can be exported and imported. It's all encompassing. So yeah, how we teach it, memorialize it, think about it is really important.
Absolutely. And there was something you mentioned. This is a slight segue, but it also impacts on our understanding and sympathy of the other. You talked about movies. And previously we had an episode on the Oscars and, the impacts of film and TV. And something just came to mind with regards to movies and war and how the American mind, and by extension, Hollywood consumers' minds, are conditioned by the narratives that movies tell. And I've noticed a periodization with Hollywood action movies where, in the late 2010s, a lot of the action movies were about soldiers in Afghanistan or in Iraq. And in the early 2000s, there was even a movie about North Korea. There was a movie about Libya. So when we think about the comedy, The Dictator, that was about essentially Libya, right? And we go back and we think about movies in the 80s and how the Russians were always the bad guys. And earlier on, the Japanese were the bad guys. And there's this conditioning and way of portraying different portions of the world as their own unique type of villains. And I almost feel like this portrayal either preempts or helps to condition the Hollywood consumer psyche to be less empathetic to the other, if that makes sense. I just wanted us to segue very quickly to just talk about how these movies impact our appreciation of war, and then subsequently how we remember conflict.
We like you said, we had mentioned this and discussed it briefly, but you go back to the 1950s and it was John Wayne, and it was this, the cowboy. It's that toxic masculinity, what it means to be a man, right? It's go fight in the war and have guns will travel, and it's we're on the right side of this, and it's that very essence of the 1950s Cold War mentality, John Wayne mentality that the kids that went into Vietnam grew up on. And so here were these kids going into Vietnam, those that volunteered and thought this was the right thing to do because their dads and their granddads had fought in war.
I wanted to be a good American. I wanted to serve my country. I couldn't wait to fight my first war.
13,000 miles. It's a long way to go to fight a war.
Don't you know what it means to me to be a Marine, Dad? Ever since I was a kid, I've wanted this. I wanted to serve my country. I want to go to Vietnam. And I'll die there if I have to.
And this is, again, what it meant to be a man. I think the best portrayal of this is Born on the 4th of July, the film about Ron Kovic that Tom Cruise stars in. I mean, it portrays this perfectly. And, and then, like you mentioned, in the 80s, you get Rambo, you get Chuck Norris, and you know, where they're killing all the Vietnamese, the other again. And then, like you said, you get to Chris Kyle and American Sniper, and you get to Zero Dark 30 and Lone Survivor and all of these things. But then you also get like the 24 show, and you get Homeland and all of those shows that also just contribute to this idea of what it means to be a hero, to be a man, to be patriotic, and all of this without them coming out and saying it. It is the idea then, if this is what's right, this is what's strong, this is what's a man, this is what you're supposed to do, then the opposite is weak, right? Peace is looked at as being weak. You're the naive one. It's weak. To be an intellectual is weak. To read a book is weak. Oh God, no, it's being a man. And so that gets, and of course it goes into video game culture, right? Call of Duty and Soldier of Fortune.
Yes.
And that is not to say that playing video games or watching a movie then makes you, this one type of person or another. I don't believe that. I played video games when I was younger, but it's, again, that idea of how we define peace versus how what is looked at as a sign of strength. And that plays out in our public history every day.
And how we glorify war. I think that was the additional 3 words.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
The topic of Vietnam has come up repeatedly, I think, because of the scale of opposition to this war and the scale of public mobilization around the issues regarding the conduct of this war. And I think this actually links to memorials themselves as institutions, as buildings, as stories. And with regards to Vietnam, I could say that memorials aren't without controversy, right? The Vietnam War Memorial has a solemn display of 58,000 names, right? But what is the fuller picture? What does this memorial signify, and what does it omit? I'm going to hand that over to you to give us a bit of insight.
Yeah. Have you ever? You've never been to the memorial? No.
No, not yet. The U.S. has got to give me a visa first.
yeah, got to get that taken care of. If you walk around the National Mall in D.C., it's the World War II Memorial, it's the Korean War Memorial, it's the Vietnam War Memorial. Right? Again, there's no peace anywhere. Right? The wall with the 58,000 names is 246 feet 9 inches long. It's impressive. I mean, it's a sight to behold, and especially on Memorial Day, you'll see people there finding their loved ones' names and things of this nature. But again, there is nowhere in the United States, not the wall, not anywhere, that mentions or talks about the 3.8 million Vietnamese that were killed in that war. And those numbers are from Robert McNamara. So, and 3.8 million. Yes. And if we added those names to the wall, it would be like multiplying it 65 times. It would probably be close to about 10 miles long. And so what message would that send if people went there and saw a wall 10 miles long with these names? And so not only what does it tell you is, to go back to your original point with another, it tells you that these lives, these 3.8 million lives, don't matter because they're Vietnamese, right? So they don't matter. It's only the 58,000 soldiers that matter. And again, it doesn't need to be one or the other, but the excluding of those 3.8 million, I think, sends a strong message of what, how we look at war. You'll see people go to Arlington Cemetery on Memorial Day. Now, Arlington Cemetery is hauntingly beautiful, from the rows and rows of crosses and unknown soldiers. And what always gets me is when you go to Arlington to see the eternal flame of John F. Kennedy, where he's buried, and his brother and so many others. Like it is. But again, what does that, when you see a cemetery with all of these people that have been killed in war, it should be causing you to think about peace. Like you shouldn't want this to happen to somebody else and go through this. But I fear it goes the opposite way. It creates more of a soldier mentality. And to juxtapose that, there are, I believe, approximately 100 peace museums in the world. The world. That's not a lot. And only
less than one per country.
Yeah. And only 7 in the United States. There's one in Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio, Chicago, Philadelphia. I think there's one in California. The most well-known, I think, is in Dayton, Ohio. But these are not large funded, giant museums. So why is it that we don't have peace museums, but we are so willing to just keep funding more and more and more on war memorials?
It was called the greatest generation any society has ever produced. They were ordinary people who half a century ago did nothing less than help save the world. Millions served in uniform, millions more served at home, and nearly 500,000 gave their lives. And yet there is no national memorial to honor their sacrifice. It is time to say thank you.
Call now and help build the National World War II Memorial.
Yeah. There is a selective focus on one over the other.
Yeah. And so shouldn't Memorial Day, shouldn't a day or every day, shouldn't, when you see something about the Vietnam War in the U.S., shouldn't it be about educating the horrors of war? And we did wrong in that war. And so again, it brings up the issue then of the phrase "never again." Right? We're hearing this a lot today. So, should the phrase "never again" in our public discourse be used? There are those that say, oh, it can only be used for the Holocaust. Just like the term Holocaust. It can only be used for what the Jewish people went through with the Nazis. There's also the conversation of what does "never again" even mean? For who? Is it just a blanket term? Just throw it up there and that kind of covers everything. It's like a all lives matter type thing. So I think that's important in terms of language and that phrase of "never again." And it kind of goes hand in hand with, if you've been to the Hiroshima Peace Park, the where you have the arch and the flame, and of course it says, "May we." There's controversy about what it actually translates to, but most will say it says, "We shall never repeat the evil." And so that phrase of "we shall never repeat this evil," what does that mean? Who is the we? Is the we the world? Is it the U.S. dropping the atomic bombs? Is it what Japan had done in the war? Who is the we? What is the evil? Is the evil war itself? Is the evil the atomic bombings? What does that mean? It's open to interpretation. I think that goes back to something we said previously, which is language and how you curate these things. What should they say? A lot of people talk about in the Holocaust Museum in the United States, what gets everybody is the shoes. When you walk in and see all the shoes, and it just hits you like, my God, these are human beings, right? How you curate these things and think about exhibits and think about the wording is, again, it's really important, and you'll see that in how many people are going to museums and things, especially on Memorial Day.
Let's turn to the actual aircraft that dropped these bombs on Japan. Now, a few exhibits actually capture the tensions of memorialization, like the Enola Gay, which was the aircraft used for the first atomic bomb.
When we first received the aircraft, it was in pretty poor condition. It sat in storage all the way up until 1984, when we bought it out and started restoration. In total, in restoration time, we took about 19 years to restore this airplane. That's about 250,000 man-hours that we have invested here.
And in 1995, the National Air and Space Museum in the US actually faced backlash over its portrayal of the plane. And the debate raged on. Was the bombing a necessary evil, or was it an unjustifiable act of mass destruction?
It really started to begin in the summer of 94, and then it kind of came to a head in 95, where the Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian federally funded. The Air and Space Museum is a big one in the US. Kids love to go to it. It's one of the more popular museums in the United States. And the decision was made to put the plane that dropped the atomic bombs, the Enola Gay, on exhibit. And it was going to be part of a much larger exhibit. There was going to be, I believe, 5 parts to it. And the initial script that was put together at the Smithsonian, it was called Crossroads, the End of World War II, the Atomic Bomb and the Origins of the Cold War. That was what it was titled. The first section was called A Fight to the Finish. And it dealt primarily with the final year of the war. And it looked at what Japan had done at Pearl Harbor and slave labor, but also the racist attitudes we had towards the Japanese.
In 1942, there were 110,000 Japanese American citizens and good standing, law-abiding people who were thrown into internment camps simply because their parents were born in the wrong country. That's all they did wrong. They had no right to a lawyer, no right to a fair trial, no right to a jury of their peers, no right to due process of any kind. The only right they had, right this way, into the internment camps. Just when these American citizens needed their rights the most, their government took them away.
Looked at all of these things kind of coming to a head, and it was very clear in the original script that we viewed the war in Japan different from Germany and Italy. And that's true, especially in our rhetoric at that time in othering the Japanese. And there were photographs of Japanese atrocities. And so immediately there began pushback where conservatives in the media and in Congress, conservative groups, veterans groups started pushing back and saying that this was being way too soft on the Japanese and that it was making the U.S. look bad, that the U.S. was wrong for doing this. And then you had the decision to drop the bomb. So they were looking at Truman's decision to drop it and what went into that. It looked at what the military said in warning him that he didn't need to use it or that it didn't need to be used, or changing surrender terms, or demonstrating the bomb. All things that we had talked about as ways to avoid, and questioning if it even ended the war, which it didn't. Even the casualty number that we discussed, that was also in the script. So what happens is the American Legion immediately comes out against this, and now the people that put this together are essentially under attack. And they are being called un-American, politically incorrect pinheads, the Washington Times called them. There was the Wall Street Journal said that it was inspired by something other than racism and bloodlust, and this was not the right approach. One after another, the Boston Globe said the script was anti-American. One disgruntled veteran said that the Japanese have, quote, bought Hawaii and lots of the United States. Let's hope they haven't bought the Smithsonian. And so when this happens, the Smithsonian brings in a group of historians and scholars to look at the scripts as well. And of course, if you're an academic and you're looking at this critically, you're going to be looked at as a leftist and everything else. And so what ends up happening is Congress gets involved. They threaten to pull funding for this. People lose their jobs over this at the Smithsonian. They decide to basically scrap the entire thing. And when they do that, at the very end, you just have a watered down, plaque here. They scuttled the big exhibit. And instead, when the actual exhibit opened in June of 1995, the label copy just said, quote, "The use of the bombs led to the immediate surrender of Japan and made unnecessary the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Such an invasion, especially if undertaken for both main sides, would have led to very heavy casualties among American and Allied troops and Japanese civilians in the military. It was thought highly unlikely that Japan, while in a very weakened military condition, would have surrendered unconditionally without such an invasion." Yeah. So where you should have a museum, and if you wanted to put this plane up, fine. But again, let's have that discussion. You can say that there are two competing narratives. Here's one narrative, here's another. Do your own research, do your own thinking. That's what a museum should do. Instead of the threats of losing your job and you're un-American. And as a result of this, that's when American University, to basically counter what was happening, started the Nuclear Studies Institute, brought Hiroshima survivors over to the U.S. during this, and partnered with Ritsumeikan University to bring students from the United States to Hiroshima and Nagasaki every year going forward. That's how I got involved in this entire topic and field of study. It really makes you think about what should something like that have? What should it look like? What should it say? Growing up and seeing that, and again, juxtaposing it with what I saw in Japan. So one of the museums in Japan that really got me was and I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, but the Oka Masahiro Memorial Museum in Nagasaki. It's a small museum, and it's a museum about what the Japanese did to other people in Japan. So to have my Japanese students who've had their history largely whitewashed, and then to have a contingent of Chinese students who have had their history whitewashed, to watch them go through this museum holding hands and seeing comfort women and beheadings and just the brutal nature of the Japanese military, and to have them crying and apologizing to one another. Isn't that what a museum should do? Reckon with these things. So imagine if the US or the UK or France said, we're going to have a museum about what we've done to other countries. First of all, in the US, I don't know how many stories it would be. And then what would it include? Like, and again, you never get it done because it would say it's un-American and da-da-da. But imagine being able to reckon with that and say the only way we're truly going to be a better country is if we acknowledge what we did, acknowledge these atrocities, and say we need to learn from this so it truly, quote unquote, never happens again. Right? It's an amazing museum that I think we could learn a lot from.
And I think that the underlying narrative that we're unearthing here is that memorial museums, much like the movies, aren't by default objective sites of learning or objective, recollections of history, but they're highly subjective and can be motivated to pursue an agenda of continuing conflict or an agenda of peace and reconciliation. And I think it's extremely important that we remind the audience that the stories we tell and the symbols we uphold actually shape our collective memory. And we all have a part in building up this picture of a collective memory. The example of Japan actually having a museum that talks about their exploitation of other people, I think is something that's extremely important and has been called for in many different ways through various protests in the UK, for example, to various countries in the global south, requesting the return of historical artifacts that were looted during periods of colonization. These sites, these museums, and these days that we actually set aside to memorialize past conflict should be used for this reconciliation agenda. But obviously there are interests that go against having such an agenda entrenched. There are continuing interests in exploitation and war. And unfortunately, many of these sites are designed to explicitly serve that agenda instead.
Yeah, it's it's a narrative of that if you grow up in the United States, there's a narrative of U.S. exceptionalism, that we are the city on the hill, that we have done nothing wrong, and so you just don't deviate from that, and this just adds to it, right? This just reaffirms it. And when I was in Brussels not too long ago, and to see still the amount of King Leopold stuff. Right. Now, I paid attention to see if every bookstore had King Leopold's Ghost, which I would highly recommend if you really want to learn what Belgium did to the Congo. But you think about that, right? How is his memory, and how is that, what is taught? How is it thought of? And it brought me to, beyond museums, the whole issue of statues and naming buildings. The two airports in Washington, D.C., one is Ronald Reagan National Airport. The other is Dulles, named after John Foster Dulles, former Secretary of State. And, if you go to Reagan National Airport, there's that statue of him. I wonder how people that know about Ronald Reagan breaking the Air Traffic Controllers Union and destroying labor in the United States, how they feel about seeing that when they pull up. For me,
at the airport,
right? For me, a long time ago, I got a grant to go and live in the former strongholds of the guerrilla, of the FMLN, the guerrilla groups in El Salvador, to research the Reagan doctrine and what we did in El Salvador. And, learning about death squads, and learning that what we did at the massacre at El Mozote, 75,000 people in total in the Civil War that we fueled and funded and trained, killed. It turns my stomach. I said it on this podcast, but I never in my personal life say Reagan Airport. It's National Airport. I won't use the word Reagan. It sickens me, to be honest. And the same with, Dulles, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. This is the guy that installed the military junta in Guatemala. This is the one that helped overthrow Jacobo Arbenz in 1954 when he kicked out United Fruit. This is the same Dulles that was, organized the Iran coup in 1953 to take out Mossadegh and install the Shah. And we have an airport named after him. The FBI building is named after J. Edgar Hoover. When you see these kind of things, and to bring it back to what we often talk about, nuclear disarmament, Roy Blunt and Claire McCaskill, the two former United States senators, one Republican and one a conservative Democrat out of Missouri. They've both retired since then. But back in, I want to say about 7 years ago, they put a bill to rename Union Station in Washington, D.C., the train station. They wanted to name it the Harry S. Truman train station. He was from Missouri, and McCaskill she had her nameplate that said the buck stops here on her desk, and they wanted. And I thought about this. I wrote a piece in Huffington Post about this. How you want to name now a train station after the man that dropped these bombs, and so these symbols of who we have streets named after. Think about, my God, the amount of things named after Columbus. All of these things play a role in our memory and how we view these things. And this was, brought to the forefront when, you had all the issues with taking down taking down racist statues, Klansmen and all these types of things, renaming things at, Woodrow Wilson building at Princeton and all of these things, and what you do with these and, where you put these statues and so on and so forth. So, this type of public history and what we do with these symbols is crucial in how we, how education is done in the world. And so with that, I wonder, is there anything, what is it? Have you ever been or know what it's like in Rwanda in terms of the genocide? Is there plaques? Is there a museum? Like, what is over there?
I know there's a memorial park in Rwanda. I haven't been personally, but I do know that there is a memorial park that is visited by the president and the senior government every year.
Mm.
And I know that there's a strong push or a strong narrative around reconciliation, around community building and whatnot. But I also know that there are conversations around continuing omissions as well, and how these omissions in some way serve or help to enarmor the continuing exploitation of Rwanda now of its neighboring region or its neighboring countries in the region. So there's a very strong core and nationalist identity in Rwanda that serves Rwandan interests, but at the same time, there's those communities at the fringe that are still under the boot of some sort of systemic repression and oppression. And these stories emanate from memorial sites as well, or in some cases are legitimized by memorial sites. So there's always this contestation.
Right.
I mean, we talk about history, his story, right? There's always contestations in how we, think about past occurrences.
Or even, the sanitation of folks, so wanting to portray somebody like Harriet Tubman as being this passive old woman in her shawl versus the strong, militant, gun-toting Harriet Tubman that was saving so many lives, right? So it's this, again, this narrative of like, oh, this is, or what is deemed safe. This is safe. We can do a monument or a museum to this, but not something that's too deemed too radical, right? So, I think all of that is crucial in our collective memory and how we look at these things. And I'm in the Netherlands right now, and a couple of years ago, the royal government and the president or the prime minister formally apologized for their role in the slave trade. And now there's a really multi-million-dollar effort to build a museum about slavery in this country. And I was told Lonnie Bunch, who actually was the person who was the head of the African American History Museum, the new one in the Smithsonian, did a great job. He's going to be in charge of this as well. And, I'll be very curious to see what is included. What do they really include here in terms of the slave trade? Because there's also those that are conservative saying they don't want this, they don't want to fund this, they don't want any part of this, right? And they want to ignore that history. It's often here you can see that, again, you learn about World War II because the Netherlands were on the right side of that one, but slavery, Indonesia, those things we don't really want to talk about. And so, it'll be very curious to see how that comes to fruition. But again, saying what should we be doing here? Because I think a lot of the museums in the U.S., the Smithsonian, just gloss over so much. And I'll be curious. There's a new Latin American museum that's being built. I'll be curious to see how that looks as well.
I mean, there's so many parallels between most museums in the global north. The first time I ever laid my eyes on the Benin bronzes, which were a collection of practically priceless bronzes that were looted from Nigeria in between 1900 and 1950. First time I ever laid eyes on it was in the United Kingdom. And I had to get a visa to get into the United Kingdom and, of course, pay the entry fee and whatnot before I could see historical artifacts that were made by my kinsmen. And I'm one of the extremely few Nigerians that possibly would ever lay their eyes on a Benin bronze in their entire lifetime, because their artifacts were pilfered from them and, locked away in the capitals of one of the Western countries. So there's even a continuing parallel as well between the establishment of memorials, the stories they choose to tell, but also the power they have to own and control access to the artifacts that make up people's histories and identities.
And it makes you think, if I were to look at those same bronzes, obviously I could never have a reaction or the way that you would for obvious reasons, right? And so when you are in that space where you are in charge of creating those memorials, those exhibits, you have to think, who is the target audience? Are you trying to inform? Are you trying to educate? Are you trying to inspire? Are you trying to right a wrong? Like, who is your audience? Because, if you go into a certain museum, you're going to have so many different reactions based on what you bring to it, your own personal experiences and what you bring to it. So that is, again, incredibly important. And then the issue of who should be in these museums, right? I mean, literally as patrons, right? There is this issue of, should a white person, the door of no return in the slave quarters in Africa, is that something that, because if you're white, you're not going to have the same reaction as if you're somebody of color. And what does that mean, in those kind of things? So I do think about the cultural element of this and who the audiences are. And, again, I would often look at my students in Japan and what they were getting out of these museums and what was hitting them. And there was an exhibit in the Hiroshima Museum they were almost like mannequins, incredibly lifelike, where their skin is dripping down. They're walking like zombies because that was obviously was happening. And so many have written about it. Survivors have talked about it. And kids were getting scared seeing it. So they made the decision to remove it. And I thought it was incredibly powerful. But again, that's not for me to say. I asked Coco Kondo, who's an atomic bomb survivor, what she thought. I was like, what did you think? And she said, if it scares the kids, I understand. And there were some people that, thought it was time, but again, what is the message? Are you trying to, because if you're trying to show the horrors of this, that does it. Yeah. But even the Hiroshima Museum versus Nagasaki are quite different, because if you go through the Hiroshima one
very quickly.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I just thought about because you mentioned a Hiroshima survivor and asking a question about what they thought about the fear that this was causing kids. And the first thing that came to my mind was, Setsuko Thurlow and some of the other survivors who were kids when they witnessed these horrors firsthand and didn't have their innocence governed by some sort of censorship. They were exposed to not just the sights and sounds, but the pain and continuing horror of living with the effects. So it's a very complex question in today's day to talk about.
Which raises another great point, which is the museums, the exhibits, the memorials, I firmly believe should be guided by the people most impacted. So I don't know, but I hope that the Hiroshima Museum, they ask survivors, what do you feel should be in here? Right? I mean, that to me is critical. We talk about in the nuclear disarmament movement, how I believe that people that are affected by colonialism and radiation and nuclear weapons should be the ones leading the organizations, because they have so much, stake in this. I hope that they're, but my fear is that you have bureaucrats and you have like everything else, and you have, people thinking they know what's best. The thought process of how you craft something and who you want for your audience and what the message portrays. And I hope that, listeners are thinking, if you're in the US, of course, Memorial Day, but just in a general sense, when you are looking at these things, how you think about them and what you think the message is. And then also think about, if this is a path you want to go for your career, because again, it is super interesting, so needed. And people often look like, oh, what can I do with a history degree? What can I do? Well, this is one path you can take, and again, there's national parks and, all these types of things. What, a plaque here or what it says and where it's placed and how it looks. It's all very, very important.
Absolutely.
Especially when there's a lack of people willing to read a 400-page book. They can get their information this way. So it's even more critical now than previously.
Exactly. And I mean, we have become almost generationally unable to read lengthy historical accounts. And so walking people through three-dimensional spaces where they can see and hear and, connect with historical occurrences is probably the most powerful way of educating people about history today. So it's become even more important that we have people with the skill set to actually recreate and make alive history in a way that is meaningful for this generation that's become much more disconnected from books. I have an interesting piece of trivia, very disconnected from the subject matter of piece, but connected to history and museums, and something I found as a personal observation that isn't talked about or documented in historical accounts yet. So I mentioned the Benin bronzes earlier in this episode. I've always found it curious how many names, many words, many styles of dressing and modes of governance in the Benin Empire, which is now in present-day Nigeria in Edo State. I always found it curious how there's so many connections between that and the Japanese way of life. From the way they wear their clothes, to the swords, to their headdress, to even what they call their political leaders. And so it was really odd and really interesting when I was looking at the Benin bronzes in the British Museum. And interspersed between around 56 plates were about 5 plates that literally had the depiction of like Japanese samurais, like extremely detailed. I took pictures of them and zoomed in, so I could probably upload this as part of the side content. But there's no account of any historical connection between the Edo people and the Japanese. But the language, the culture, the government, and the bronzes clearly depict that there was even a visual connection. Like some artist somewhere saw samurais during the height of the Benin Empire and included them in the Benin bronzes. So I think that's a little bit of a trivia mind blown.
Somebody out there that's looking for a dissertation topic, there you go, get on it.
Absolutely. You know, we're given, you know, intel for people to explore.
Exactly. You know, I think too of, you know, what is the responsibility of adults when it comes to children too, because I remember when the African American History Museum first opened and you had to get tickets to get in there. It was crazy how many people wanted to get in and so on and so forth. And it starts like each floor brings you up. So the basement, the bottom floor starts with slavery. So you ultimately make it up to sports, pop culture, things of that nature. And I'm looking at, you know, I'm down in the basement looking at the bottom floor, looking at all these pieces about slavery. And then a whole group of kids ran past me. And they were clearly on a field trip. And they weren't looking at anything. They were literally running. And they had obviously just stopped off at a corner bodega and they all bought MAGA hats. So to watch these kids running around with these Trump hats on in this sacred place, really, kind of hit me. Like, what are we doing here? Like, should they even be allowed in this? If you're not, you know, this is not just some pop culture thing. This is, you know. And so then when I made my way up a couple more floors, there is a piece where they have an entire behind glass Ku Klux Klan outfit, the cone-shaped hat, the white robe, and discusses, you know, Ku Klux Klan. And I thought to myself, years from now, will that red Make America Great hat, will that be in an exhibit next to the Ku Klux Klan? Right? What will that artifact mean years from now? Because to so many now, it represents racism and hate and so much of what's bad in the world. So you think about even now, you think about what's happening in Palestine and, you know, or Ukraine, and you think about future exhibits and museums and memorials, right? And what it's going to look like and what we would include and so on and so forth. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's something that's I always kind of thinking about how, you know, how we are looking at these things. And then the other piece is will, like so many other things, will we tragically see museums, brick and mortar museums, start to go away because of virtual reality? Are you going to put, an Oculus on and you're going to virtually go through a museum with an avatar? And is that a good thing because it will help reach more people that can't travel to these places? Or is it taking the place of physically seeing that and what emotionally that can do to you? And I'm not sure what is the right answer to that.
It's a very a complex question, not tricky. Tricky is a bit too reductive. There is definitely scope, and I'm working backwards from your comment here. There is scope for increasing the accessibility of these historical spaces by leveraging digital tools and technologies that we've developed in the past few years. But there's always going to be a question about the connection, the physical connection, being in spaces that are considered sacred, for example, and what that means for people's appreciation of historical activities that went on there. But also, secondly, I wonder how much control will be retained in future recollections of today's events, in the sense that how much can institutions and organizations be able to censor in our collective recollection, given that we are documenting, petabytes of data on a daily basis on what would become historical events in the future. We have so much more detail now of the day-to-day occurrences, even inside the theater of war. Let's take Gaza, for example. We think about social media and we think about all of this content being produced as fleeting, primarily because our brains right now have been designed to consume social media in a fleeting manner. So we're scrolling up in the endless scroll and we're sort of forgetting about things, and our attention span isn't that great. But we are creating data that is somewhat permanent, if we think about it. And they are being stored in data servers worldwide, physical structures, where they can be retrieved, reconstructed, and put on display. And so it means that we're having a much more fuller picture of things that, think of 9/11, even before the advent of social media as it is today. But just the fact that camcorders were much more prevalent during that event. And when we talk about 9/11, we always see the videos from multiple angles of bystanders, of news channels, of whatnot, looking at those planes smashing into the Twin Towers. Almost a 360-degree coverage. And there's been tons of analysis and even conspiracy theories on the basis of that footage. And that's 2001 level coverage. So what does this mean going into the future? Would Israelis, for example, be able to glorify their occupation of Palestine in the same way that the British were able to glorify the occupation of, much of West Africa, with the gory pictures of the violence that occurred? It's going to be an interesting future to be a historian.
Yes. As always, we like to close out our shows with a book recommendation for you. So mine is, considering the topic today, Living with the Bomb, American and Japanese Cultural Conflicts in the Nuclear Age, edited by Laura Hine and Mark Selden. What is yours, Ola?
That's definitely a book I would want to read. I haven't actually had the pleasure of looking through it. Mine is an interesting and somewhat disconnected book from our specific topic of memorials today, but it actually plays a very key part in retelling a historical story of a country that's not been covered as much as it should be. So my recommendation is Atomic Step from Tugjan Casanova.
Great friend Tugjan, yes.
Oh, yes. And she looks at how Kazakhstan essentially gave up the nuclear bomb. But in identifying the process of Kazakhstan, acquiescing to becoming a non-nuclear weapon state, there's a lot of granular historical data and research that took her over about 10 years to conduct, to be able to tell this very comprehensive story. And I think I definitely want to give this book a shout out just to illustrate historical research done right.
Yeah, Taksan's an amazing scholar. It's a beautiful book from cover all the way through. So yeah, definitely check that book out. And as you are eating your hot dog or taking in your baseball game or enjoying whatever it is you do for Memorial Day, we hope that you will take a little bit of time out to kind of reflect and think about these museums, these memorials that you are seeing, and think about what the message is, what you are learning from them, and maybe how you would do things either similar or different if you were in charge of creating one of these pieces. If you liked what you heard, please hit that subscribe button, give us a follow. Things like the Che Guevara story or some of the other things like the Enola Gay exhibit controversy, we will have sources in the show notes on our website for you if you want to learn more about that. And until then, we thank our team, especially Jason, Lex International, and we will see you all in the next episode. So thank you again for listening. See you soon. Bye.
See you next time. Bye. Mind Blown is produced by Jackson Street Collective and made possible by Lex International.